hope you're all doing well today, staying cool out there. I know it's very, very hot here in New York, but I hope you're all doing well. My name is Liz Solkin, and I would like to welcome you to the Sustainability Laboratories Conversation Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tonight is my privilege to introduce to you Rebecca McMackin. She's an ecological horticulturalist and garden designer based in Connecticut. She spends her time writing, lecturing, and creating beautiful gardens. As the Arboretum Curator at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, Rebecca looks after one of NYC's top tree collections, restores historic grave sites, and brings ecological life back to 400 acres of urban green space. A 2023 Harvard Loeb Fellow, she has studied ecological design, the history of native plant movements, and science communication. Rebecca lectures on garden politics, landscape management, and pollination ecology, and has written for publications like the New York Times and appeared on PBS's Garden Smart. She holds M.Sc degrees in biology from the University of Victoria and landscape design from Columbia University. Today, we're so lucky to listen to a conversation about sustainability and horticulture between Rebecca and the founding director of the Sustainability Laboratory, Dr. Michael Ben-Eli. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael. How are you doing, Michael?
Thank you, Liz. Very hot here in New York. Thank you for opening. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being there. It's a very exciting topic today. Now that you had this very nice formal introduction, Rebecca, maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience and on a more personal note, tell us a little bit about growing up, milestones in your early development, important inspirations, influences, key events, mentors. How did you get into your field? In short, what made you what you are today?
Thanks, Michael. It's so nice to see you, and I'm so pleased to be here and support the Sustainability Laboratory. You know, I grew up wild, arguably a little feral, on a hobby farm, a very small hobby farm in New England. And I just grew up gardening. We all did. And I had like my first garden when I was 6, and I just grew carrots. And so I didn't think of it as a possible career path. It was just part of our lives, like cooking or, doing the dishes. And then I lived this completely unrelated, totally wild youth where I moved to New York City when I was a teenager, and I worked in art and fashion and even drag for a little while, and somehow ended up doing a degree in ecology in British Columbia. And I wasn't thinking of landscapes then. I was more interested in freshwater policy, but that is where I fell in love with plants for the first time and was introduced to them as characters with these rich and mysterious histories and behaviors. And I started to pay attention to them in a way that I had just always taken them for granted. And so when I finished that degree, I moved into this tiny cabin on my dad's land in Connecticut to just kind of recover from a lot of very difficult things grad school, among them. And I started gardening really as a way to heal myself, the same way you might do yoga or bake bread. And I realized that gardening had all of the complexity and mystery and experimentation that ecology did, but without academia. That I could just do this in my backyard and other people's land and public land. I could garden and have this amazing relationship with plants and the world around me. And so I became a gardener, and I moved to New York City to garden for the Parks Department. And I was soon the head gardener for Washington Square Park, which is in downtown Manhattan. And it is the center, arguably, of political life in New York City. If there's a protest, if there's a march, it ends in Washington Square Park. And so I was a gardener that I was very happy. I loved it. It was really fun. And there was this march there. There was a march called the It Gets Better March, where a bunch of queer folks were marching to let young queer people know that it gets better and don't give up on life. And I came in the next day to clean up the park, and it was destroyed. The park had been completely obliterated. It was like rainbow glow sticks and spray paint everywhere. And I was cleaning it up, and I realized that kind of action and dialogue happens in spaces that are held and designed by people, and that's public space. And I became a public servant in that, moment where I realized that was my job, was holding and creating the space for people to really participate in democracy. And so it's really these both of those two things. And then eventually, of course, I found my way to Brooklyn Bridge Park, which was another just absolutely wonderful experience.
Well, you've been involved in designing some very complex landscapes, and we are used to a tidy, neat approach for conventional garden design. This approach can be quite harmful, as it turns out. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yes, and let me share my screen and show you the horrors of classical American landscape design. So this is when you put into Google, American garden. This is what comes up, right? It is a landscape that is very much about control and the display of wealth and honestly colonialism. There's all these things and like the fear of nature, right? Keeping nature back. And it shouldn't be any surprise to any of us that like everything in the context in which we live is somewhat problematic and complicated, and so of course gardens and landscapes are complicated and problematic as well. And while they're like arguably the majority of American landscapes look like this, not all of them do, and many people have been making ecologically functional landscapes forever. But it's worth really interrogating this and learning how to read what we're actually looking at here. And so what I see when I look at this first is a landscape completely dominated by turf. Turf grass is an aesthetic really and a relationship to land that came over from Europe either in the 1800s or 1900s, depending on who you talk to. And it's really, again, about control and a way to communicate that this land could be farmed, but we don't have to because we have all these resources to just keep it grass. I like to think that lawns are a way of saying I can walk anywhere I want. I can just be on this land in any place. And I'm not against lawns, even though there's this like really passionate anti-lawn, kill your lawn movement right now. I'm not against them, but I do think they should be very precious things and very rare, and they should not be a default relationship to the landscape, which is what they are now. And you can see here, anywhere that isn't a garden or a tree or a path, the default is turf. And that's how we end up with 44 million acres of turf grass in the United States. It is the single largest irrigated crop in all of the US is turf grass. And so it's a problem. You also see a bunch of shrubs that are pruned, very neat and tight, and space in between them. There's no leaves on the ground. It's just wood chips. So the soil is not allowed to function as actual soil. All of the debris of those plants are carted away, and then mulch is put into the landscape. Most of these plants are probably exotic. They're not actually from wherever we are, right? This could be a photo from Arizona, California, New England. We have no idea where we are in space with this garden design. And the plants are from who knows where. They're also probably fertilized with nitrogen-based fertilizers. They're treated probably with systemic insecticides that stay in the plants and can harm any of the insects that do come to visit them. They're irrigated and they're sterile, right? There's not a lot of wildlife. There's no movement in this landscape. It's made to stay this way. It is maintained this way. Those shrubs will never be allowed to grow any bigger than they actually are. And really, it's a limited concept of beauty. And importantly also, and I think this is, people often miss out on this, it is maintained by people who are often exploited labor. And that, like, it's fascinating to me the extent to which that labor relation with the crews who do the mowing and whatnot often also defines the design of these landscapes as well. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. I could contrast this if you'd like, with a more modern and ecological landscape at this point as well, Michael.
Yeah, well, you obviously introduced botanical complexity as you did in your work with the Brooklyn Bridge Park. And that stands for a whole new vision of green space. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about that and show us, not just
Absolutely.
talk, show us what has been done there.
Absolutely. So I'll jump right into that, but I just thought that very quickly I could show you a counter design that is what this movement in like a more residential sense looks like, where landscapes have minimal lawns, complex ecosystems, and are really maintained, no inputs, no irrigation, and are maintained by people who are educated and treated with respect. And this is what that landscape looks like on the ground layer. This is, again, just really quickly, a traditional horticultural design where each plant is given its own space, and then mulch is like really displayed. Americans love to display mulch. And this is a photo from Brooklyn Bridge Park, where the aesthetics just start to get more wild. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. So Brooklyn Bridge Park is a brand new 85-acre post-industrial park built on the coast of Long Island. And Brooklyn, really, it's right between Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the East River runs between the two. And you can see the Brooklyn Bridge in this photo here. This is just one pier out of many piers. And it was built those piers were built in the 1950s as shipping piers, and then they soon fell into disuse. And so the city decided they were going to develop them, and the community organized to turn them into these piers into a park rather than high-rise developments. And so Brooklyn Bridge Park was then made after it took decades of work, as you can imagine, political work, fundraising work, all of this real estate, all of the many, many organizations that had to work together, the community, local community, ecologists, et cetera. It was designed by Michael von Valkenburg and Associates, and it's part of the post-industrial landscape architecture movement. And this is literally this is most of the park, but it's maybe like 2/3 of the park. It's humongous, and it wraps around and goes right underneath the Manhattan Bridge, which is the next bridge at the very top of the slide. And so I was the director of horticulture there, and I worked there for 11 years, from just when it opened in 2010 until we finished it just a couple years ago. And then I left to pursue this fellowship. But it was an absolutely incredible experience to see something of this scale get built. I think a lot of us take land for granted. We see a hill, we think, oh, that hill has always been there. And to see someone build a hill and recognize the work that goes into designing and building a hill is really a revelation. And it's really the most difficult context you can possibly imagine, right? This is on biggest city in the country, on the water, on essentially concrete. If you can imagine a more difficult place to garden, it's hard really to think of it. So we flooded during Hurricane Sandy. It's like a very, very difficult environment. But the reality is that these sorts of landscapes are more adaptable and resilient than those formal designs that we looked at before, those like very simplistic designs. An environment, a design like this actually has a much better chance of withstanding disturbance and a flood than those hosta in 6 feet of wood chips that we looked at in front of a house. And so one of the reasons why that is because, number one, they're filled with plants that evolved on this land. So those plants are very well adapted to whatever weather conditions come their way, and the rain of a region as well. They don't usually require extra rain, extra irrigation, unless they're in very particular circumstances. Those plants we call native plants, and they're a big part of the ecological gardening movement. And so Brooklyn Bridge Park is filled. It's not exclusively native plants, but it's filled with them. And then also it's made up of all of these ecosystems, right? Most parks there's lawns, there's gardens, but this is a salt marsh. We have three, I say we because I'm always thinking I'm still there, but there are three salt marshes at Brooklyn Bridge Park. There's meadows, there's grasslands, there's woodlands, there's all of these real ecosystems, constructed but highly functional ecosystems for people and wildlife to actively utilize. That again makes them more resilient with this crazy changing world. But of course, it's all very beautiful as well. And one of the really central design bedrocks of this sort of work, but really this park specifically, is this concept that MVVA came up with of managed succession. And that is the idea that, in those gardens that we looked at before, those like classical American gardens that are not allowed to move and grow, you could place those shrubs, you could come back in 50 years and the trees will be larger and everything else will be the exact same size. In an environment like this, we're more trying to kickstart an ecological system than we are trying to maintain anything. And so plants are allowed to grow, they're allowed to move, they're allowed to reproduce, they're even allowed to die. And the idea is that the horticulture staff are sort of the managers of those processes. We're picking winners sometimes, we're removing losers, we're supporting those processes, but allowing those natural processes to function. And that's very, very important for climate change and all of the ills that we're facing in these times. So this is from when I first got there. This is a photo from 2010. This is all the same shot. That we planted these tiny, tiny little trees and then a bunch of sun perennial plants. And then the trees grew and slowly started growing. And you can see as they start to grow, the grasses start to get shaded out. And then we went in and we actually planted an understory underneath those grasses of shade plants that would thrive in those new conditions. And then we kind of reached, a peak ecosystem, and things have kind of stabilized now that the trees are like a full canopy and there's an understory beneath them. But there was a lot of change originally, and we were encouraged. We encouraged that change, and that complexity allows for adaptation and evolution. And so, and the design, like the super chic design of MVVA, also allowed for us to be more wild in the gardens as well, which was really nice. And as I was mentioning before, the gardeners at Brooklyn Bridge Park and the horticulture staff in general were respected and allowed to follow their own interests. And they are really the people, right? It's the design and the landscape, but the people who are caring for the landscape are also driving the biodiversity of that landscape as well. And they did an amazing job. The team did like such an incredible job of caring for this landscape and experimenting with strategies to encourage biodiversity in the biggest city in the country and in like one of the harshest environments. And so we would research the ecology of the animals. When we saw birds or insects in the park, we would research their ecology, figure out what they needed in order to thrive in the park, and then alter our garden practices in a way that better supported them. And so this is Christina, and she's cutting our bunch grasses in a way that supports bumblebees. We worked with entomologists to learn about bumblebee life cycles. And what we found was that when we like made these, like, we cut grasses so that the bumblebees could actually overwinter in a better environment. And then one of the gardeners identified this bumblebee, which is Bombus fervidus, the great northern golden bumblebee. And it is an S1 critically imperiled animal in New York State. And this is just one of many rare animals that we had at Brooklyn Bridge Park as a result of planting the right plants for them, but also managing the landscape in a way that supported these organisms. And so Bombus fervidus is an amazing creature because it's actually very rare. If you look at this as a map of their distribution, if you look at, they're very rare in New York in general. But when you get to New York City, there's a density of their population, and the same with Philly. And if you look over here in Ithaca, these are urban bumblebees. And what researchers now think is that they are very sensitive to the chemicals used in suburban environments and the diseases from agriculturally managed bees in rural environments. And so they actually live in cities as a refuge from these other more dangerous environments for them. And I think a lot of us tend to think of cities as ecologically destitute. But the reality is that they're just very, very different. And they can even be safe haven for certain animals like Bombus fourvitus. So I think that was, arguably the best part of working at Brooklyn Bridge Park was not just caring for this amazing landscape and working for this wonderful team, but discovering the ways that through our gardening practices, we could figure out and then share these strategies for supporting biodiversity.
So that diversity then is a principle in horticultural design is of the essence, which brings us to the very difficult threat to biodiversity inflicted on species and habitats everywhere around the world. Can you give us a little bit of your own take on that, on the biodiversity threat around the world?
So it is existentially critical right now. Like we are really playing with fire, and it's terrifying, and it's up there with climate change. If we solve climate change and we can't figure out how to solve biodiversity collapse, which is really what's happening now, biodiversity is collapsing. We won't have secure food systems. It's really absolutely wild right now. So you've probably heard of the insect apocalypse, which is this phrase that I hope has permeated out into the world and that everyone is familiar with it. Some of us it's easy to perceive these things. Like when I was younger and we would drive in a car, the windshield used to get covered in insects. And now there's nothing. There's like almost no insects on the windshield. So every one of us can see this in our own lives, but the statistics are absolutely terrifying. And they are that we have lost nearly half of insect biomass on planet Earth in the last 30 years. Just this like astronomical amount of creatures gone off the face of the earth. And recent research that just came out this winter from in Nature magazine, in Nature journal, researchers found that it's even worse for very common insects, that like all insect life is diminishing at a rate of 1 to 2% per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? We're like, oh, it's just 1 to 2%, but it actually adds up to 20% over. Math is failing me. I think it's a decade. So it's just this. It's an astronomical amount. And for those more common insects that we are used to seeing in our lives, they are being reduced by 8% per year. And those are the insects that feed the birds. And if you have read about the bird populations in North America, they're also doing very poorly. We've lost over recent decades a third of birds in North America, and almost all of them are they feed their babies insects. And one of the there's of course like climate change and habitat destruction are all part of this. It's all meshed together. But also not having the insects in order to feed their babies is a really important part of that bird decline as well. And so that's this dangerous situation for wildlife and plants. But it's also very dangerous for people. We are already in a condition where over 500,000 people die every year due to decreased food availability from decreased pollination. So 1 in every 3 bites of food that we all eat is the result of pollination, that we are reliant on bees and a few other organisms to pollinate our food for us. And when they decline, we literally don't have the food, and people are currently suffering from that now, and it's only going to get worse. And so another, it's very important when you consider, when you zoom even farther out to really get a full picture of this, insects are the main way through which energy from the sun makes its way into the food chain, right? The energy from the sun is gobbled up by plants and turned into foliage or roots or what have you. And insects eat that, the herbivores eat that, and then someone eats them and they make their way up the food chain. And so when you consider that we've lost nearly half of them, right, there's a impending cascade of biodiversity loss that is, we think, the result of this insect loss as well. So, we love butterflies, right? Part of this work is just like, oh, butterflies are beautiful. Everyone should have them in their lives, right? There's like this part of this that is just about beauty and enjoyment and a rich experience. But there's also like a really critical, very dangerous, very important part of this work that we can all be engaged in as well.
This is monoculturing the biosphere, so to speak. I think we spoke about it a little bit, but the system sciences and cybernetics in particular have shown us that the viability, that the dynamic stability, the long-term viability of complex system is depends entirely on their complexity, on their internal variety. That what makes them able to adapt and reconfigure themselves and so forth. So multiple elements, interactions, and interdependence are key. Can you give us some glimpses into those characteristics in ecologically functional landscapes?
That is so cool. It just blows my mind how well those theories dovetail, because it's absolutely central to stability to have ecological complexity. Those, not only is there redundancy and overlapping uses of space in complex ecological systems, but it's actually how they stay stable. If you think about a plant, like this is a Eastern red columbine here, and a pollinator partner, the ruby-throated hummingbird. If you think about that plant, and that the ruby-throated hummingbird is visiting those flowers that provide the best nectar for them, right? And so the hummingbird is and pollinating them when they visit. And so the hummingbird is selecting that next generation. The hummingbird is going to pollinate the flower is going to set seed, and then that next generation is going to grow as they are selected by the hummingbird. So there's this interrelationship between those two species that they're literally not just reliant on each other, they've evolved together. The flower has been selected by that bird, and the bird's life and the bird's migratory movements and stuff have been supported by that plant. And plants can't move, right? They don't move. Evolution is how they stay alive, right? Like a plant, the birds can migrate to someplace else with climate change and crazy weather and habitat destruction, if they're lucky. But plants can't really do that as easily. The way that they do that is by sexual selection, random mutation, that next generation of the seeds that the bird has helped select is more able to adapt to the changing conditions that have been around forever, right? Earth has always been changing. And it's through that relationship that sexual selection and mutation allows those plants populations to persist, because there's a variety of genetic profiles for different that would survive under different conditions. And so they're always able to survive in those changing environments. Right now, everything is changing so much. It's changing so much that all of these populations are struggling to maintain their space in time, right? And sometimes the flowers will bloom too early, and they'll be done blooming by the time that the hummingbirds get there. And so they won't get pollinated. And that next generation might be genetically weaker. And the birds are then weaker because they don't have the specially tailored nectar that this flower has evolved to provide for them. And so those kinds of relationships, it's complexity, right? Like we need a lot of flowers to support this hummingbird. It's not just this one flower. There's a whole host of flowers that support this hummingbird. That complexity and the interrelationship between these species is necessary just to stay in one spot on Earth. And amidst climate change, it becomes even more and more critical.
That's amazing. Let's get back to our tidy garden, the kind of low variety garden, if you will. And a new trends in horticulture design seems to call into question, because of emphasizing complexity, some of our ideas about aesthetics and beauty and order and compulsive need to control. Will you elaborate a little bit about those aspects that are very interesting?
Absolutely, absolutely. So these gardens are always a respite, right? If you think about in history, the way that I think of gardening as like a human impulse. Like every society, every culture has gardened and taken care of land in some capacity or another. But gardens, as we understand them, have been really created and cultivated as a place to get away from the rest of the world. And whatever like ails you about the world, gardens provide you an alternative. If you live in the desert, gardens in those regions are usually wet and shady and cool. If you live in an environment you're terrified of, gardens have walls and there's mowed landscape, and so you can see everything, and it gives you a sense of control. And so right now, I think my theory of modern garden design right now, of putting all that ecological stuff to the side, even, is that we have effectively controlled so much of planet Earth and just tamed it, that the thing that we need respite from is that level of control, that it no longer works to put people at ease. It no longer gives people that sense of rest that it used to. And so you're seeing, just from an from an aesthetic perspective, from like modern garden design is moving into more grass dominated, more naturalistic, more complicated garden designs than what we see in what we've seen in traditional formal horticulture. In the ecological world, there's a bunch of new aesthetics like this one here, right? This is a rose mallow that we left the stems up at Brooklyn Bridge Park so they could support all of the wildlife in the park. And it's a very different aesthetic than a classic ornamental horticulture. Normally, you don't leave dead wood in a landscape. We clean that up and disappear it. And here it's allowed to be sculptural. And this, it's not every garden or every landscape that's going to say, look at this and be like, I can make that work in my backyard, right? This is a very specific, very niche look that works at Brooklyn Bridge Park and works in some landscapes, but not all landscapes. And so we are pushing that aesthetic, evolution as far as we can at Brooklyn Bridge Park, but still keeping things cared for and beautiful. Like it's very, very central for these ecological landscapes to read as beautiful for people. Otherwise, they're not going to be valued. And so there's this wonderful experimentation among so many designers all over the world right now, trying to find ways to use native plants to get that ecological functionality in landscapes that still read as either classically ornamental or a new type of beauty. And so this is a garden that one of the gardeners at Brooklyn Bridge Park designed, Junko Fujimoto. And it's just, I think, I can't imagine someone looking at this and thinking it's not pretty, right? It's just everybody's idea of prettiness is here, and it's all native plants, and it supports a wide variety of wildlife as well. And then this is a garden that I made at my dad's house in Connecticut. And again, it's just really wild, a jumble of plants, really beneficial ecologically, not necessarily a look for every landscape. But if you can contain it, if you can maybe mow around it or put it in a container, sometimes if you give it a clear edge to a wild landscape, it makes it a little bit more palatable and acceptable for people. This is a beautiful garden that one of my friends took a photo of in Arizona. And again, one of the things that I love about this is that it shows you where you are on planet Earth, right? When you use the plants, when you mimic the ecology of the surrounding region, you cultivate a sense of place. And I think that that is one of the things that a lot of us suffer from right now as well, is just this homogeneity of everything, right? It's almost like entropy and like ecological, everything is just getting mixed up. And there's less and less organization, ecological organization. And so this is really an attempt to keep that organization in place. Let people know, like, make something beautiful that works as a landscape for people while still keeping the integrity of where you are on planet Earth, and in making a usable environment for wildlife as well. This is a garden that I did outside of the Brooklyn Museum in Brooklyn. And I think, I love this garden because it's like in the middle of the city. It's like literally in the middle of a huge intersection in Brooklyn. And yeah, it has these really, my friend Brooke Clausen designed the landscape around it, and it has like a really harsh, really clean container for the plants in which I could just go wild and have like a really, not messy, it's still legible aesthetically, but just a really a more ecologically functional design than would be possible without those clean lines of the landscape. And yeah, this is just another view of it.
Maybe it's unfair to push you in that direction, but I wonder if you can speculate a little bit about that notion of complexity and messiness.
Mm-hmm.
If we move from the ecology ideas, issues, to cultural and political kind of thing, I wonder what it says about the kind of dominant need to control everything.
Yeah, it's a hard one. And it's such a hard, I love to put this work, both ecology and horticulture, within a political and human context. It's so important to do that, but it also gets really dicey when you start applying the same ethos that we have to plants to human societies as well. And I've studied a lot of the ways that very nefarious movements in the past have weaponized native plants to further reactionary agendas. Like, for instance, literally the Nazis would get rid of exotic plants and use native plants and promote native plants as like this sort of landscape purity attempt to further their political movement. And so in the United States, at least, we really try to focus on using language to explain the work that we're doing that doesn't foster xenophobia, that still makes it clear that people from all over the world are still okay to mix it up but we should still try to preserve the integrity of these ecological systems, plant systems, animal systems, aquatic systems, and protect the functionality of those systems as well. This is a whole conversation that we could talk about for hours and hours. I would love to talk more and get your thoughts on it, Michael, because we all talk about it all the time, just absolutely constantly in this field.
Well, I would just make a comment here that I think that the same concept of complexity and variety that we advocate for horticulture is true for social systems as well. And they will be richer and more relaxed if you allow for variety and complexity without judgment and all the other things. So I think the lessons that you are learning with plants have tremendous implication to the social domains as well. Now, you've spoken a lot about the healthy benefits of healthy parks and their importance, particularly in the concrete and still scapes of urban settings. Can you tell us more about these individual and public health aspects of green parks?
Sure. So living in a verdant and healthy ecosystem has really major health effects for humanity. It's not just important for the animals and plants around us, it's really important for us. And, I think with recent studies on microbiomes and whatnot, it's clear to a lot of people that we are our environment, right? If you are living in a healthy or unhealthy environment, the particles in that environment literally become part of your body, and the air is like, you breathe it in. And so that the environment that we live in is literally part of us. There was a fascinating study, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, I think it was out of Switzerland, where they took a bunch of daycares and they replaced the concrete play areas in those daycares with either raised beds for gardening or like a garden landscape, and they encouraged the kids to go play in those landscapes. And they saw in a matter of weeks to months, the immune system function of those kids just absolutely skyrocket, right? Because they're finally in a healthy environment. And the researchers actually speculated that the reason that we're seeing this rise, just unprecedented rise of autoimmune disorders, is due to a lack of biodiversity, a lack of access to biodiversity that many of us are facing. And so there's also these amazing studies right now. There's just been this torrent of research on the topic. But they've shown that like listening to birdsong, being around trees, all of those things make us happier and feel less lonely. And those might seem like emotional benefits that could benefit us emotionally, but there are also studies that show that when you feel less lonely and more part of a community, you live longer, you're less likely to have a heart attack. There's real physiological benefits to those emotional benefits that being in green space supplies as well. There was also, I think, especially in the United States, there's a very troubled history of certain areas of cities being cared for, and then other areas not being cared for at all. Often it's, redlining is the terminology that we use to talk about those areas that have been historically populated by people of color and then neglected from both an infrastructure, education, healthcare, and environmental perspective. And they found in LA, a study a couple of years ago in LA found that in those red line neighborhoods, when you looked at a wealthier, historically white neighborhood and a poorer, historically Black neighborhood, not only was the ecology very different, but the bird species in LA were literally racially segregated. That it's wild, right? It's like ridiculous that like the bird species in the wealthier neighborhoods were more diverse, more specialized, and the bird species in the poor neighborhoods were like pigeons and starlings, right? And more adapted to generalist conditions. And so there's like, it's really a social justice issue, these access, like, and it works. We've found that when people do improve people's environments, the change is huge and profound. There was a study in Philadelphia done out of the Urban Health Lab in Pennsylvania, and they went in and they looked at abandoned lots in high crime neighborhoods. And they cleaned up these abandoned lots and turned them into little parks and greened them. And they found that gun crime directly around those parks went down 29%. Just huge, right? Just like life-changing conditions by creating these little parks for people. And the researchers thought that, people were more able to go outside, they felt safer, they felt less anxious in their lives. There's like so many benefits to doing this work. And so I think that I take so much heart and inspiration from that, because it means that like we can solve these problems. Like these problems are huge and they're horrible and they're really difficult, but we have the knowledge and we have the skills. It's just a matter of actually making it happen.
So can the Brooklyn Bridge Park type of experience be amplified and scaled up? Why is it important to do so? And how can we redesign cities in general to integrate more biorichness into the built environment. So it's not still islands.
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
than,
Absolutely. So, yes, 100%, we can and should do this all over the place. We should scale it. We should be, a pot on someone's stoop, and as large as when cities are first being, planned, green space should be absolutely central. And it's important. It's very important that we do this work because the reality is that right now, half of humanity lives in cities, half of people. And that number is expected to reach 2/3 by 2050 as the world population hits 9.8 billion. And not only is it important for humanity, but it's important for all of the animals. They're still using these cities, right? Like New York City is right on the Northeast migratory networks for birds. And so they're coming through. They're coming through these cities. And it's really up to us to decide if we want to make these spaces safe and welcoming, or treacherous and unlivable. And I think that way that there's two ways to scale, right? And I'm involved in both of them, but there's folks like Doug Tallamy and others who promote individuals to garden on their own land or on any land they have access to, even if it's a pot, right? To like, if you have a front yard, if you have a backyard, if you have a stoop garden, like you should be planting native plants, and that's going to be supporting all of this stuff. So there's like a private realm to supporting this work and encouraging scaling, and it's not small, right? There was a study recently that found that when you look at American yards, like what is a yard, they add it all up, you get the amount of land that equals 3 state of Texas's, right? So it's this huge amount of land that is private land in the United States. And so if individual landowners or renters or what have you really took this seriously, shrunk their lawns, started to garden ecologically, it would have profound change. In cities, there's less land, and most of the land is really is publicly owned. A lot of the land is publicly owned. And so that's my realm, right? I'm like a public servant. I live solidly in the public realm. And in cities, like in New York City, it's retrofitting, right? At this point, the city's there. You need to find places to squeeze in. Like this garden that we're looking at right now, this was turf before this garden was built, right? So we found a little pocket to squeeze in, and we've done surveys here and found dozens of native bee species visiting this garden. It's being used. It's one of those islands, as you said, right? It's one of those islands ecologically, but it is a link between a botanical garden, Prospect Park, and then, whatever homeowner gardens are around. So those tiny little spaces are of critical importance. But there's also a lot of space in cities that is being misused, right? In New York City, a great example is free on-street parking. That is just a pet cause of mine to get rid of because it's so much space. It's like, I can't remember the exact number, but it's multiple central parks in New York City we just give away so that people can store their cars for free on the street. It makes no sense whatsoever. There's so many of the difficulties that New Yorkers face that could be solved by just strategically taking some of that parking and redirecting it towards green space, towards sanitation, towards recreation, so towards bike lanes. There's so many issues that could be solved by just having the bravery, right, to make those infrastructure change that it is very, very rare to find politicians and developers and whatnot that are willing to take those steps. But those steps certainly exist. And some cities are absolutely taking them. It's amazing to see.
but looking at a large city, these are complex places. And given the current institutional, regulatory, economic, and land use practices, what do you think are the prospects of achieving such a new vision of biodiversity-rich urban landscape?
So, of course, proponents of this work face the usual foes, right? There's capitalism, there's a view of nature and land that is extractive only, right? That is a huge problem. And importantly, there is an idea that some people are worthy of a healthy and verdant environment and some people aren't, right? That's also been like a main driver of biodiversity loss in the world, is this idea that, you know, we're going to build this beautiful little thing for us, but everybody else is going to be over here in this like hellscape. And so Brooklyn Bridge Park worked, and many parks get built, honestly and kind of bleakly, because it makes very wealthy people even wealthier, right? That like New York City is run by developers, the same way Texas is run by oil, right? Like developers dictate which parks get built, where they get built, all of that stuff. And the reality is that a lot of these larger infrastructure and, you know, green space projects happen because of the real estate value around them. And that system, really pioneered by the High Line and Brooklyn Bridge Park, has been proven time and again, right? So it's not the best system, right? We don't love that system because it's really problematic, but it works. And so it's proliferating. The all over the world, in places like Dubai and Singapore, like global capital has really realized the benefit of green space, and they're doing that work of greening cities in that way. Of course, it is not. It is only, again, that's only supporting a small part of the population, and when we're really looking to create green space for everybody, we need different tactics, and we haven't figured them out yet. There's a lot of thousands and thousands of really smart, really good people working on that, trying to figure out how to do this and scale it in a way that really supports all communities. And it's hard because, especially, I know familiarly in New York, but really in a lot of other cities, there's this tragic thing that happens called green gentrification. That when you go into a city and a neighborhood and you build a park or you make it beautiful and clean it up and a wonderful space for the people who live there, the rents go up, people lose their housing, and they get kicked out of those neighborhoods. And so now a lot of park development happens, and there's conferences, there's organizations that are trying to find and experimenting with different ways to make people's environments healthy and beautiful while keeping them in their homes, keeping them in their environments. It's really, really important. And so there's people doing it, right? But without that driving force of capital, it's just much harder, but it's certainly not impossible. And I think that this wave of folks interested in ecology, interested in, you know, equity, interested in beauty and helping the world, you know, there's this huge wave of people getting into this work that really brings me a lot of hope, that we can do it, right? Like, think of that tiny little lot in Philadelphia that reduced gun crime. It's just a matter of actually going out and making it happen.
Well, maybe that should be our last question. I mean, given the because those entrenched institutional aspects obviously call for major change, and that will at best take some time, what can individuals and local communities do in the meantime to enrich their life and the biodiversity of the planet?
Awesome question. I think the most important thing we can all do is plant plants that evolved wherever we are, right? And we call them native plants, as I said. They just evolved where you are. They have those relationships with the other animals and other plants around you. And so that's really, really critical. And it has the capacity, I think, to even be revolutionary. It starts very, very small, you know, just planting a plant that supports butterflies, like planting milkweed and supporting monarch butterflies. But the results can be immediate and incredibly profound. I gave a TED talk recently, and I talked about this plant called Anaphyllus, or pearly everlasting, and then these little butterflies called American beauties that would come and American ladies land on the plant, and they were so happy to lay their eggs on this plant. And so I gave that talk, and it's been seen by an absolutely ridiculous number of people, and that story spread around. And so I keep getting these emails from people who bought that plant, the pearly everlasting, and put it in their gardens, and almost immediately butterflies came and started laying their eggs on that plant. And that's really important ecologically. It's really wonderful that they're supporting those communities. That's real work. But it's also like incredible for the people. It's incredible. I feel so fortunate to be able to share that experience with people, to encourage people to recognize their role in creating a healthy environment for others, not only for themselves, but for others, right? It's a beautiful thing for people to realize that they have that capacity, because a lot of us, I think we're all steeped in this narrative of humanity being bad and that humans are a cancer or whatever. And is really disheartening. And the reality is that there are bad systems and bad portions of society, but that people ourselves, humanity, has a capacity to be very good, and we can build new systems, and we can create and cultivate new relationships with the world around us in ways that help each other thrive, and then all of these other organisms to thrive as well. So I see those little actions of planting those plants and really supporting them as starting people down a path that leads to much broader change. It's really incredibly hopeful that it's a recognition that we are part of these systems, that we are supporting them, they are supporting us, and that caring for the land wherever you are, taking care of the organisms around you and the people around you and the communities around you, is a really, really big part of it as well.
Well, Rebecca, I'm really full of admiration of what you're doing. You're not only helping to create beautiful environments, but I think the experience that you are having and your colleagues are really producing or rather showcasing principles that we have to apply to a healthy socioeconomic reality altogether. And I think that those little stories of success are tremendously powerful and bring hope that we can actually make it at the end and turn the whole planet into a paradise as it used to be in the beginning, right? Thank you very much, Rebecca. It was really, really wonderful. And continue with your work, of course, was great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.